Hey guys, so today I'm going to be doing my June wrap up. I really didn't read, I feel, that many books this month. I kind of did because I had a lot of rereads, as you will see, but in terms of reading like other books other than the rereads, I read 5 books this month. So I'm just going to breeze through the books that I reread first. All of these books I've talked about in the past, like I feel quite a bit before, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about them. The first 4 books that I reread were in preparation for my exams that I had. The Art Lover by Carol Marceau. This was one that I originally gave I think like 3 stars, but having reread it a couple of times, I think I would give it a higher rating, like 4 or 5 stars. I really like this one in the end. And then Passing by Nella Larson. This is a 4-star read for me. It's kind of a very short novella and really enjoyed this one as well, would recommend. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is a 5-star read for me, so good. And then Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rees. The last book that I reread this month was the Classics Clique Classic of the Month, which is my Classics Goodreads book club. If you want to join it, it's always linked in the info bar below, but this month we read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a book that I've read many times in the past because it's one of my all-time favourites. I love it. I've done a full spoiler-free review of this if you want to check that out. That'll be linked down below as well as any other reviews for the books that I'm going to mention as well. So moving on to the books that I read for the first time this month, I'm gonna, as usual, talk about them in order from my least favourite to my most favourite. So my lowest star rating that I had for all of these books this month was a 3-star, and the first one of those is Baby by Annalise Jockins. This one caught my interest because it's a adult psychological thriller by a New Zealand author about a woman who pretty much runs away with her gym instructor. She knows that the gym instructor is going through some troubles with her husband or partner and wants to run away, so she offers a bunch of money and things like that, and they end up buying a boat together. Essentially, the psychological thriller part of it is that our main character is obsessed with this gym instructor. She's basically in love with her, and she had this whole fantasy of them running away together and starting a new life together. They come into contact with some different people. There's a bit of jealousy that starts up. There's something sinister that happens, and yeah. This one, to be honest, was a disappointment for me. I wish that it hadn't been described on the cover as a psychological thriller. I think if I had have gone into it not thinking of it as a thriller, I would have enjoyed it more, because it really wasn't thrilling for me. It was 100% predictable the entire way through. I don't understand why it was meant to be a thriller. Our main character is super paranoid and completely delusional, so I guess that's where the thriller aspect of it comes in, but it's so predictable. We don't really get deep into the main character enough to understand why she's delusional and all that. We don't get much of her backstory, so I just didn't find this book particularly interesting. My second 3-star read for the month was Leah on the Offbeat by Becky Albertalli. This is kind of the second book, or like the companion novel to Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, and I have a full spoiler-free review of this one if you want to check that down below for more of my thoughts on it. Basically, it was a fun book. It was fun being back in the Simon universe. This one is in like their senior year of high school, so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed like seeing them leading up to prom and everything, but I really didn't like Leah as a character, so I couldn't fully enjoy this book. My third and final 3-star read for the month was P.S. I Still Love You by Jenny Han. This is the second book in the To All the Boys I've Loved Before trilogy, and it was such great timing that I read this month, because as I was reading this, the trailer for the Netflix movie, I think it's going to be a movie, of To All the Boys I've Loved Before came out, and I saw the trailer and it looks so good. I'm so excited, especially I think from that first book. The trailer really captures almost the aesthetic feel of that book, and I just have high expectations for that Netflix movie. I think it's going to be so good. So excited about that. But anyway, yeah, I was reading this book this month. I gave To All the Boys I've Loved Before 4 stars, I think. So this one was not as enjoyable for me as that first one was. It was certainly an emotional roller coaster. I really liked the kind of storyline that was being dealt with at the beginning of this book. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil the first book. If you haven't read that one yet, you should. But the basic premise of the first book is that Lara Jean, the main character, writes love letters to her crushes without ever sending them, but then one day the letters get sent out to all of the boys that she's had crushes on, and it is just the aftermath of that. So this is a second book that follows on from those events in the first book. So I liked the initial plot line in the beginning of this book, where that was going, but I didn't like where the story went in the end. Peter was a character that I really liked, and then by the end of this book he was totally ruined for me. I just have no respect for Peter whatsoever, and kind of it goes hand in hand with that. But Lara Jean, she just comes across as a total idiot in this book, and I really don't like that she took a lot of things on herself that were not her fault, and it really bothers me that she seemed to think things were her fault when they clearly weren't. And I don't like the ending of this book. I don't like how it ended. If you've read it, you know what I mean. I don't know whether I would have been happy either way, because it was kind of like the beginning of this book I felt one way, and then halfway through I felt a different way, and then at the end it kind of went back, expecting me to go back to feeling the first way that I felt, but I just couldn't feel it that way anymore. I'm really excited to read the third book in this series, so that tells you something. Like, it's not like I read this and gave it 3 stars and thought meh. I really am hooked in, and I want to know what happens next. I'm really invested in these characters, so I can't wait to read the third book in this trilogy. Moving on to my 4-star read of the month, there was only one of those, and that was You by Carolyn Kepnes. I have a full spoiler-free review of this book on my channel as well, so I'll link that down below too. This is another psychological thriller, and this one was so good. So good. It's told from the point of view of the psycho person, which is something that I hadn't read in a thriller before, so I really enjoyed that point of view. And the premise of the story is that there's a guy who works in a bookstore. He falls for a woman and decides that he is going to stalk her, present himself in such a way, and also manipulate parts of her life to make her fall for him. So it's super creepy and super awesome, and you're just so in his head that it's kind of frightening. So I really enjoyed this book. Highly recommend it. My final book is also technically a reread, but it's the first time that I had like rated it on Goodreads or anything like that. Normally I don't put my my rereads on Goodreads, but this one I hadn't rated on Goodreads before, so I did put it there, and it had been since high school since I read this one. But it's Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. This is one of his plays, obviously, super famous one. You probably all already know what it's about, but in case you don't, it's a tragedy about Romeo and Juliet. They're from families who despise each other. They're constantly getting in sword fights and killing one another. So when Romeo and Juliet fall in love and secretly get married, it can only mean trouble. I enjoyed reading this more than I've ever enjoyed reading it before. Overall, it's super tragic, obviously, and I found it like quite emotional, but then at the same time there are moments in this that are so hilarious, and I kind of didn't remember that about this play, so I really enjoyed those really funny moments. The characters have a lot of like witty banter between themselves, and something that's brilliant about this edition, this is the Folger Shakespeare Library edition. I'll link it in the info bar below in case you want to get your hands on it. These are super cheap and super awesome because they have notes alongside the text. So this page is like the play, and then this page is notes. So certain words and things like that will have a note on the side explaining what that word means, or if there's a phrase that doesn't really make sense to us, it will give a bit of a little translation as to what it means, or if there's a reference to something that was popular in Shakespeare's time that is not familiar to us anymore, it will have that in there as well. And at the beginning of this, it also goes through a bit of background about Shakespeare's life in the theatre and things like that, but also Shakespeare's language, which is amazing. And I wish I had have had this guide to Shakespeare's language when I studied it in high school, because I would have understood it so much better. And I feel like these are probably things that my teachers explained, but they just never really sank in. So just briefly running through it, firstly there's Shakespeare's words, because it explains how some of the words that Shakespeare uses are the same words that we still use nowadays, but they had different meanings for him in that time. So in the notes as you're reading the play, it will give you the definition as Shakespeare's using the word. And also he sometimes deliberately uses words that have a double meaning, which is where all that witty like wordplay comes in from the characters that give you those really funny moments. because they're kind of using a lot of double entendre and things like that, which I never realized before. So yeah, that was really helpful and really added to my enjoyment of the play. And then also it goes into Shakespeare's sentences, because you guys might notice with Shakespeare's language, which I always just thought was like how people spoke back then or whatever, a lot of his sentences sound like they're kind of backwards. Like instead of saying he goes, Shakespeare will say goes he, and it just is quite hard to get your head around. And this in the introduction explains why he does that. Like sometimes it's to create a certain rhythm, or it's to emphasize a particular word, so he'll just switch things around in a sentence that we normally wouldn't. And sometimes he switches like verbs and subjects and objects around in a sentence, and just reading that and understanding why he did that just makes it make so much more sense. And knowing that he does that as well, if I read a sentence that sounds a bit funny, I can think in my head of like, okay, if I rearranged it, this is what he meant. And I just feel like I get Shakespeare so much more having read this edition than I ever did in the past. So highly recommend this if you're someone who is not super familiar with Shakespeare and you find it confusing but you want to give it a go. These editions so far, fantastic. So I have a bunch of other Shakespeare plays in this edition that I'm going to be reading over the next few weeks as well. So after I've read all of the ones that I have, I might do a kind of review video on the Folger editions, because I just have been so impressed with this. But anyway, getting back to the play, highly enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, I know it really irritates some people, but how fickle Romeo is with his affections. Like he's, at the beginning, he's in love with this girl called Rosalind, and he actually goes on and on and on about Rosalind for quite a while. I didn't realize how much he talks about her. And then he meets Juliet. He kind of gets dragged to a party by Mercutio, I think, or it might be his other friend. Anyway, and he swears he's never going to fall in love with anyone else except Rosalind, and then he sees Juliet and completely forgets about Rosalind. He's like, Rosalind who? And I just found that really, really hilarious. So that's it for my June wrap up. If you've read any of these books, let me know your thoughts on them in the comments down below, or if you're going to pick them up, let me know that as well. And I'll see you guys with another video in a couple days. Bye.